encouraging because, as I said, there is no podcast recorder here, and I don't carry a smartphone. So the only way a podcast will happen is if you guys make it. So if one of you makes a podcast and then sends me the MP4, I'm happy to post it up. So think about that, because it's a shared responsibility of the class if you want a podcast. And of course, the person who makes it has the podcast first. It's on their phone. Let's see, what else? I'm in a good mood today because it's Friday. This implies that we've completed a week. 9 to go, piece of cake. Are you guys' schedules starting to shape up? You kind of are starting to know what your classes are and such like, which sections you're in? Okay, good. Then, so today we'll be talking about this in a moment, but first I want to come back to this. So, office hours. We don't know when they are. Someone sent me, not a mom, Jasmine, was it you? Someone sent me an email about it. We don't know when they are. We're picking them today. So, first off, Mondays after class works really well for me. You guys have had a weekend to review. Now, how many people have class right at 10? Another class. Raise your hands high. That means I got to accommodate you guys, right? So, I want to have at least one more office hour later in the week. I can do Fridays 10 to 11. But that then steps on the same thing. So Wednesdays 10 to 11. So I really think it's going to come out to Friday. Now, of those who couldn't come here, so that's Janine and Shahan and those folks, could make 11 to 12:30. Does that fix it for you? Okay, now, let's say for now, so we're doing a doodle poll, but we're doing it the old-fashioned way. So if these are our 2 office hours, how many people are excluded? Raise your hands if you can't. Okay. Does any of the others fix it, Jose, or? Louder? Okay, so let's have it start this way. But Jose, like for instance, I'm very happy. What is today? Friday after class. Do you have something after class today? Well, walk into my car, we'll talk, we'll at least get started. So, does this all make sense? So for now, this and this are my 2 office hours. I will post this to Canvas so you don't have to think about it, and we'll go from there. And for those who are orphaned, we'll fix something. We'll make another one that suits the folks. Yes, Quincy, is it?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Where's your office at?
Thank you. That's the next slide.
Oh, sorry.
Great money in the line. See that? Justin asked me the same question. Okay, so where's my office hour? I live in Hickey Gym because my research has always been human. So I need showers and treadmills and human stuff. It's funny, I can't talk unless I can point to things. I don't know why. So here's Hickey Gym. That's the track. This is the bookstore, and this is often called the Death Star. Does everyone understand where Hickey Gym is? Okay, good. Then, my office is on the top tier. Don't go in where the buses turn around. If you go in here, you'll get lost, because this side and that side, the second floors don't connect. And the only way to get from here to here is to go through where a bunch of naked men are in the locker. It gets really complicated. So, I'm on the upper tier. My office is 269 Hickey, and it's upstairs on this side. So, the dance studio and the women's gymnastics practice floor is downstairs. You just go up above there. Does that make sense? That's where my office is. Now, in terms of your lab, I'm actually kind of pleased that I was able to pull off a minor miracle. I've talked to the contractor. We've separated our schedules. I reconfigured the last remaining room into something that will offer. It's going to be crowded, but I'd like you to think of it as cozy. It's going to be cozy. And the trick, though, is what we've had to do is normally one enters Hickey Gymnasium from right across the hall from the main entrance to the women's locker room. So right about where the C is the way you normally enter the human performance lab. Because there is piles of wet cement that will sink into, I don't want you to do that. I want you to come in the back door And that is almost directly across the A Street field from Halil House. Halil House has a big sign on it, so it's easy to see. And if you were to come straight across the A Street field, there's an outside facing door. We'll have signs on it, and that's where you enter. That make any sense? Did that answer the questions? Okay. A side to the women, because we're going to be, our first lab is doing cardiovascular examinations, much as a cardiologist or healthcare practitioner would do. We need access to the women's torsos in a modest way. Women will be working completely separately from the men with no crosstalk, so you feel comfortable. Under your clothing, wear something kind of skimpy, like your smallest jaw bra or a bikini top, because that allows your fellow females to inch the stethoscope around. Make sense? So they can get to the heart valves and hear the sounds of your heart without embarrassment or discomfort. Does that make sense? And Amy, remind me today when we do the run through, I'll show you how to make what we call a modesty towel, which is a gym towel, and it's sort of like a napkin that's been folded in a special way, and it allows you to have a towel covering yourself, and you can just move the towel up and down, or your colleagues can do it without causing you to be embarrassed. Am I making sense? Am I sounding sensitive? And you, if I'm not, approach me separately if you're shy about this. Okay? All right. So on to the, I didn't put this under the clothes thing first, and then asking the wigs. It looked really wrong at first when I wrote it. It just said, how many just get it done? So, I have a copy. I got one more administrative thing. Shandy returned this, so if anyone wants to check the Mormon and Heller out over the weekend, remember it's also online as a link. Thank you, Quan and others who sent it to me, Kelly. Okay? So you can pick this up if you want on a 2-hour or a 2-day loan over the weekend. Here is a rough idea of what you would read for the next 2 lectures. And notice we start to move off of, I believe the link only gets us chapters 1 and 2. It's a teaser to see if you like it. But as I recall, they use Mormon and Heller, I believe, for MPB 101. Let's say in the summer, did you use it? Yeah. So you may have access to it already from your MPB 101 or 101C class.
Question about the office hours?
Yes.
Do you have an office hours the same room?
No, good question. Office hours are upstairs, where there's a bank of offices. Laboratory is downstairs, but they're in the same building and in the same wing of the building.
Is there a room number for your office?
Yeah, 269. Us two want to get together, and I'm almost 69. That's a slight exaggeration. All right, is that okay so far? All right. So remember, we were talking a little bit about last time, so I'm going to start actual material picking up from where we left off last time. And at the end of last time, I was making some talk, a little connection. If circulatory systems have a tubular system where pressurized blood that's been squozen by the heart is moving around. And then they have a diffusional level that's mostly about capillaries that are right next to the cells. I was saying 2 things about those 2 components can interact a little bit. For instance, one of the major things that the pumpy tubes do is once the diffusional gradient starts to get used up, you sweep away the old blood and push in new blood that has a fresh diffusional gradient. Right? That's a connection between the 2. We also saw that on the level of fluid exchange, that when you dilate open an arteriole, it allows more of the pressure that the heart put into the blood to actually reach the capillary level. And just like one of those garden hoses that you water with that has the holes in it, the higher you turn up the pressure, the more it squirts fluid out into the garden. And so we saw that open arterioles tend to create more extravasation of fluid. So, yes, Kelly?
Does the diffusional rate go down as the speed of the blood flow
if it gets too hot at the peak levels. But at resting levels, certainly, you would like to sweep the old blood out and bring in fresh blood. Yes? So, I left you with the idea of, so what should we do about the pump? Remember, I challenged you to think a little bit if you went to the weight room between now and then, and now and then, here and then and now. What is the pump about? Why do your muscles and the veins on top of them become so visibly engorged after a weight training? What's up with that? Yes?
So maybe during exercise, your muscles require a lot more oxygen, and they also produce a lot more CO2 and other waste. So this will be a lot more flow of blood to like the capillaries there.
So the capillaries open, and then as a consequence, what happens? So in terms of oxygen delivery, you want that gradient refreshed more quickly. But then there's a consequence of putting the capillaries under a higher pressure, which is what I was just talking about.
Less natural diffusion.
No, it has to do with fluid, vascular fluid. It leaks out into the muscle, and so the muscle actually swells. It becomes turgid with fluid. Does that make sense? This is why the pump, it's also why, because once that fluid then remobilizes, it winds up in your veins, so you see your veins better too. But most of the extravasated fluid is juice. It's like a sponge that suddenly becomes saturated with water. Does this make sense? It's why 45, you finish the workout, you're going, ooh, this is great. And then 45 minutes later, stop. Yeah, it's just fluid. So my friend Vic Convertino, who trained here and got his PhD, actually published on this. He's a big weightlifter. And this is showing you the change in the plasma volume during a 1 hour weight lift. Notice, so it's not sweating, right? Because the major change happens from the start of the workout to within the first, it's like 5 or 10 minutes. That you get this huge drop. And notice you've lost 1/4 of your plasma volume. Anyone ever get dizzy at the end of a weight lift, particularly if you've done a lot of legs? This is part of it. Sure, if I cut open your vein and drop a pint on the pavement, you'll get dizzy too. The good news about the pump is the fluid hasn't left the body. It's just temporarily relocated into the interstitial space. I can prove that. When you finish, this is post. Got it, this is post. So pre, 1 hour of weightlifting there, and then this is post. Notice if you'll stop dilating the arterioles, and they shut down, then the fluid will move back into your vascular system, and an hour later, you don't look nearly as good in the muscles, but you're cardiovascularly re-stimulated. Does that make sense? I was thinking that's cool when I can show you something that you guys have seen and relate it to capillary dynamics. And then here's a graph showing you that indeed something like 75% of the variability in how big the muscle is right after a workout is connected to how much the plasma volume dropped. So the pump is mostly about a temporary extravasation of fluid. Fluid leaves the vessel system because of what you're doing at the capillary level, and then it comes back later. Is that all okay? It's kind of fun. It's a follow-up from last time.
For clarification, it's metabolic waste that causes the...
Good for you. So someone deduced that. Tell me your name. David. Should have been brave. David. Tell me your name in the back. We just did that the other day. Tim did. David was pointing out, as I said before, each different bed of vessels have slightly different control. Muscles are absolutely controlled by metabolic waste. I sometimes call it, David, byproducts of contraction. Right? Anything that is left over when you do a contraction tends to make arterioles dilate the muscle system. Is that all right? You can ignore that. Okay, on we go to today's lecture. So what we're going to talk about today is there seems to be a little bit of overlap, and I'm slightly confused about what today's lecture is about. But it seems to be about, we're going to finish talking about the blood vessels, and then quickly move on to blood pressure, because blood pressure is the regulated variable in the cardiovascular system. And blood pressure is the result of two things. It's the result of how much blood the heart shove out, or how much power and energy did the heart put into the system, and a function of how many vessels are open and how wide. That's what makes blood pressure. So then once we've finished talking about blood pressure, we'll talk specifically about the heart and its job in pressurizing the circulation, and kind of come back to pressure volume loops, which we talked about before. Thank you, Kelly. All right, so we said this, the purpose of the cardiovascular system, this problem of having multiple organs is what makes things difficult. So you have to think about adjusting the resistances of each organ bed so that you will get the appropriate amount of flow of the total cardiac output. As I said before, you don't want to give 50% to the kidney, so you choke the kidney down a bit. I particularly like the muscle. We have muscle here, so here, skeletal muscle. At rest, 15% of your total cardiac output of 5 liters is going through your resting muscle. During exercise, this value could go up easily 2,000%, 20-fold, as a result of the vasodilatory metabolites and the increased pumping of the heart. All right, just a reminder, I don't know if you've thought about this recently, ignore this side for now and look at this side. When you put resistances end on end, it becomes, whatever is the tightest radius will have the highest resistance. And so it becomes the elephant in the living room, since these are all adding up. If you look at this, that's half the size of that, so that means that has something like 4 times more resistance to flow. And this is even bigger, so it's sort of like 400, 100, and 25. And so the elephant in the living room is where the choke point is. And that's easy. That has to do with why we use arterials, showing the pressure along these. That's why we use arterials to drop the pressure to something that's reasonable for the capillaries without blowing them out. Does that make sense? Now, this graph of parallel vascular beds deals with the issue of different organs or different tissues with different metabolic needs. And here, if you have another channel, it allows flow. So it's not as restrictive as that. If you put in another channel, it allows flow, but it also adds resistance. And so you add them up as the inverse. It's kind of weird, and I don't fully understand the math, but when you add a new channel, you are adding resistance to flow, but you're also adding the opportunity to flow. And so the math comes out that you do it as 1 over each organ resistance gives you 1 over the total resistance. I will not make you do that on an exam. You don't have to calculate that, but to capture the idea, so of this total pressure head, which of these 3 gets most of the flow? Right? And the one that's most choked gets the smallest. Okay, that's all you need to know for now. And you can sit around and calculate this if you want. I don't want to. I will tend to, because I can't get my mathematics labeler to label properly. It ought to be mean resistance arteries would be the proper. But because of this adding relationship, I'm putting summa on there. So whenever you see me do this, that's what most people call TG often, but I use the old-fashioned physiology nomenclature. So resistance, what kind of resistance? Arterial. And then if it's been added or whatever, sum or mean. Just like we should see. So we can almost skip this slide because David and Quincy together answered the issue. So we just said what turns these spigots on, these entry spigots, the arterials. But if I'm an exercise person, we're going to do a quick exercise thing. How come I would say as an exercise person? So when we exercise, what turns these spigots off and then on? And for those of you who didn't have yet to do 101, this is now going to blow your mind a little. Does anyone remember from 101? You start exercising. Yeah, the sympathetic nervous system, at the onset of exercise, the body's solution to which organ is about to need the most flow is to shut down all of the organ beds with a massive central command of vasoconstriction. And then now, David, which of the organs are going to open back up most quickly? The ones that are most metabolically active. So it's an absolutely brilliant system that most of us would never think of. But at least in the sort of millisecond to second range, as you start exercise, you shut blood flow off everywhere. And then you reperfuse within a few seconds those vessel beds that are making the metabolites. Yes, ma'am?
Are there different concentrations of beta and alpha nerve receptors in blood vessels?
A little bit, but that, remember, we think of the sympathetic nervous system as a global, or a, we call it mass discharge. You don't try to discriminate. Now, you're kind of clever that depending on what receptors, so the nerve endings all spew out the same amount. But certain organs, for instance, it has to do with differential effect, Kelly, has to do with receptors. So if the heart muscle, for every alpha-1 agonist, which is a constrictor, also has a beta-2 receptor, well then you get offsetting penalties, and you'll see at the onset of exercise, the heart is probably the only organ that doesn't really shut down. The heart and brain are the only two that don't shut down their flow. And that's all receptors. Good question. All right, on to blood pressure. Am I going too fast? It's okay. So, mean arterial pressure is the regulated variable in the arterial tree, and there's all sorts of feedback mechanisms that control it. I want to point out that the heart is the organ that never rests. If you look at it with a big time scale, until you die. But if you look at it with a finer time scale, you'd say the heart is the organ that spends half of every second resting. And so remember that during diastole, aortic valve closes. This captures diastole. So when the heart is not connected to the vessels, when the door of the aortic valve is shut, the vessels are separated from the heart. And so this is diastolic pressure. This would be the period of systole. And so if you really want to know mean arterial pressure, those of you who've had calculus more recently, I think you take the integral, the integral of this, and you get a mean, the area under the curve, over the time. I don't want to do that, and no doctors can. You know, apparently I had a year of calculus because I got into med school, but there's no way to prove that anymore with my brain. I had a year of calculus. So the reason there's two numbers when we report blood pressure is the quick and dirty way is to say, well, what's the highest pressure when the heart's connected through an open aortic valve? And then what's the lowest pressure you detect when the heart is relaxing and the aortic valve is closed? And so we say 1 blood, 1 over 8. So when you report two blood pressures, you're reporting the high and the low. Any good mathematician would have said, well, the integral of the blood pressure curve is whatever it is. It usually comes out to a mean around 100, at rest 95. Okay? So we're going to measure blood pressure. It's going to be one of the things that's the most time consuming. In our lab, I want you to be sure to read that American Heart Association guideline. I have to say that many of you have been exposed to blood pressure measurement, and I'm not trying to diminish that experience. It's very important what you've had, and I appreciate it. However, almost no, has anyone ever given you the American Heart Association guidelines for indirect measurement of blood pressure? Okay, good. So you're beginners, and please realize that, and now start to read the real rules if you want a diagnostic quality value. Kelly in the ambulance, and I've lost your name today. Why? Mary. Have you ever seen the technique of measuring the blood pressure by touch, by palpation? Okay, that's a classic shortcut of EMTs because that stupid siren makes a lot of sound, and it's really hard to hear the blood pressure. And you know, in the ambulance, you're far more concerned, is there a palpable pressure, than to resolve it at the level that a doctor's office would do for something less critical. So I'm not diminishing the power of palpation. It's, yes, we're going to even do, I hope we do that in the lab so you guys get a chance to see it. But read the guidelines and we'll talk about sort of diagnostic quality blood pressures in a non-emergent setting such as a cardiologist piece. Have I said enough? So what you're doing, just to go through the indirect measurement as a concept, what you're doing with the cuff, I need to emphasize, see that manometer there? Buck stupid, no silicone in there, no jet. Dumb, 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 dumb. You guys are always hoping that somehow it knows. It don't know nothing. By the way, the bouncing of the needle is never an indication of what the actual blood pressure is. The bouncing of the needle means squat, no matter what you've been told. What this cuff can do is when you apply it to an object and pump up, it will tell you the transmural pressure of whatever is contained inside that object. I'm sorry, I said it wrong. It will tell you how hard the cuff is squeezing upon that object. So the only thing that tells you is the pressure inside there. To determine blood pressure, what you have to do is observe some sort of vascular phenomenon. So watch. We pump the blood pressure up to, say, 160. If we've done it right, we have crushed the blood vessels in the arm, and there is no flow. I want you to, during lab, you're going to feel the pulse. When the cuff is up, there must be no pulse, right? The person's not dead, so you know it's a regional thing. Then you start to lower the cuff pressure. Remember, all that knows is how much pressure is inside of it. You lower the cuff pressure and you start to observe for some form of reperfusion phenomenon. Kelly and Mary in the ambulance, maybe their phenomenon of reperfusion would be to feel the radial pulse. If you're doing auscultatory blood pressures, you listen for the reestablishment of flow distal to the cuff. So it's always the observation you make, not the cuff, that tells you the blood pressure. Am I making sense? I'm trying to emphasize that you're way more important than the cuff. You can leave a blood pressure cuff alone in a room with a patient. You never come back in with a blood pressure. So, if I ask you a question about that arterial pressure that we're going to measure, where does it come from? Pressure comes from the heart. From the arteries. What's that? And the answer is, turn this on. The answer is yes. Think about it. I mean, really, the heart is where that energy came from, the pressurized it. But if I slip my wrist and shoot blood onto the ground, it ceases to have pressure because it is no longer contained inside the artery. So the wrapping, the Greek word would be temenos, the cauldron that holds the blood in, is actually what's preserving the pressure the heart put in there. And again, if you slip my wrist and let's put half of my blood volume on the pavement, you'll discover my blood pressure rapidly becomes crappy. Not because anything's wrong with my heart, but because there was nothing for the heart to act upon. An insufficient volume of blood relative to the blood vessels. Does that make sense? So the answer is yes, all of them. Oh, and in about 2 slides, maybe that's, I guess in time. In about 2 slides, I'll show you an example of what happens if any one of these is broken, can create hypotension, low blood pressure, clinically low blood pressure. So there seem to be like three slides here that all say, there's 2 slides that say the same thing, and I'm not going to belabor it. But I think you guys know that you can, if the flow through an organ is a function of the driving pressure gradient, delta pressure, and inversely related to the resistance of the vessels in that organ. You're familiar with that equation. You could say for the whole body that the total cardiac output has got to be equal to the mean arterial pressure because the vena cava pressure drops to about 0. So you get to neglect it, and all you have to do is know the driving pressure divided by the total peripheral resistance. Well, and so you get this equation, which we're going to rearrange. By the way, if you can't remember this equation, oh, by the way, for quantity rate per minute, so that's usually it ought to have a cardiac on it. So this is the quantity of cardiac flow, cardiac output, pressure, mean of the arterioles. That's how you write it. And This is the sub-resistance of the arteries. If you can't remember that, if you remember your electrical physics, it's the same as Ohm's law. Pressure in an electrical circuit is voltage. Flow in an electrical circuit is amperage. And that ought to be divided by resistance. Resistance is what slows electron flow. So yeah, that should be divided. Sorry about that error. Makes you come to class. I have a few errors. So everything I just said is this. I'm rearranging this rather than put it in terms of flow. Let's put it in terms of the regulated variable. So mean arterial pressure is the product of the amount of blood being shoved into the arterial tree and the resistance to flow of the arterial tree. Is that okay? That's the regulated value. That is what should not drop. By the way, this tells you immediately, Quincy, back to the observation that during exercise, we've already deduced we're going to need more flow. If you're going to hold this fairly constant, every time you double that, you darn well better drop this in half, or the blood vessels will explode. And so, for the most part, in normal situations, these are inversely related. They're controller variables that are changing inversely in order to hold the pressure constant. All okay so far? No one's head has exploded yet? Okay, cool. So, this I think is very cool. So what we're going to do is, back to that little quiz of what causes the pressure in the blood, the arteries, and the heart working together. We'll do an example, a clinical example of hypotension. I want to point out the word shock. There's a lot of these words. Stress, in psych, Aaron, you're a psych major. Stress often has a different meaning, psycho-emotional stress, to a psych major than to a physiologist who would say, for instance, this person's under stress. Show me the catecholamines and the cortisol. Right? Different perspectives. I want to point out that shock has the same two words. Someone could be in an auto accident and you talk to them and they're not injured at all. And a psychologist will say they're in shock. The severity and intensity of the experience was so much it blew them away. That is not circulatory shock. Circulatory shock is a measurable collapse of the cardiovascular system. Often the person who's in psycho-emotional shock, Mary, will have an elevated blood pressure. They're freaked. If you measure their blood pressure time. Circulatory shock is when mean arterial pressure falls well below normal, 70 millimeters of mercury instead of 100, for some reason. With me? So these are separate. Now, let's do an easy one. Where do we say the pressure energy comes from at the beginning of each second? The heart. So if you hurt the heart, right, if the heart's having a massive heart attack and the amount of force it can produce is dropped down to 25% of normal, it will not impart enough energy to the blood and the blood will be low pressure. Absolutely typical for someone having a large heart attack to be hypotensive. Let's go to the gangbangers. This Friday and Saturday night, the medical center will receive several people who have left a pint or two of their blood on Stockton Boulevard somewhere. Where have you put your blood? And because they can't fill the vessels enough to tense them, they will actually wind up with a low cardiac filling and a low pressure. That make sense? These two have to do with the control of your arterioles. And so vasodilator release. In fact, anyone who's ever squatted weights really, really hard, like you've done 30 squats at as high as you can, and then you rack it, you'll often step away and go, you know what I mean? A little head rush. Anyone familiar with this? Well, you made too many internal vasodilators. That's what's doing it. You're opening up so many vessels, the heart is struggling to fill it. You can get exactly the same result if someone, occasionally a young teen, will try to commit suicide using mom or dad's blood pressure pills. Very ugly. Often unsuccessful if you get them to the ER. But a really unpleasant experience for the person because they dilate open all of their blood vessels and they wind up with a very, very low blood pressure. In fact, if you're lucky and it happens quick enough, they vomit out most of the pills because they don't have enough blood flow to maintain your gut. So sometimes it's self-correcting. Am I making sense? Don't try this at home. And then finally, you talk about neurogenic shock. Sometimes someone who's had an impact, remember the sympathetic nervous system lives here on the spinal cord in the thoracic area. That's where the little neurons that are the primary sympathetic. In certain forms of spinal cord trauma, you can make those so sick they can't generate their central command signal to maintain blood pressure. And so blood pressure will fall. So many people who've had a serious spinal cord injury in the acute phase, you need to bring them in flat. Because if you sit them upright, they immediately pass out. They've lost the ability to shut down their blood vessels. So you kind of have to keep most of their blood vessels at or higher than their heart if you want them to have a blood pressure. If that makes sense? Isn't that kind of cool? And it illustrates the problem or the nature that the arterial pressure is indeed the result of the energy the heart puts into the vessels, the resistance of the blood vessels to forward flow, and the containment that they create. Oh, and the blood therein. Okay, so I think we said most of this. Oh, cool, I see what we're about. So now that we've talked about pressure, let me just see where we're headed. We're going to start to talk about the heart in just a moment. In fact, right now. So the heart is the energizer of the blood. Just as in terms of review, if the left side of cardiac output is 5 liters per minute, going out to the body, how much blood is moving across the lung every minute from the pulmonary artery to the pulmonary vein? 5. Cardiac output and venous return must be quantitatively equal, right? Because otherwise, if there's too much venous return, the heart blows up like a balloon. That's called congestive heart failure. If the heart can't pump away the blood that arrives, then the heart shrinks down and starts clapping, and that's cavitation of the pump in heart failure. So, does that mean if they're equal flows, does that mean the pressure in the two systems is the same? Juan's shaking his head, and apparently he knows. So which is higher, systemic or pulmonary? Systemic is much higher. And watch. So there's mean arterial pressure in systemic circulation, 100. Mean arterial pressure in the pulmonary circulation is down around 25. Watch how you can deduce. Tell me what this means about the level of resistance to forward flow in the pulmonary circulation. It's very low, isn't it? You get the same amount of total flow, 5 liters a minute, with this tiny little pressure hit. Pulmonary arteries must be very relaxed. Dude, flow through me. Right? They're very relaxed. And do not receive sympathetic command the way the rest of the body does. There's just no nerve terminals. Okay? Yeah, see how much you know? I'm just kind of showing you stuff you knew. You can read that on your own. It's everything we talked about so far. And I think with the last 5-ish minutes, this is a volleyball set. I'm going to set up our next topic, which is the heart. And we can think about this over the weekend. So we're going to start to talk about focus on the heart, and clearly the heart pressurizes the blood, but what we haven't thought about is, and how difficult is that for the heart? The heart is clearly doing a service by putting energy into the blood, but that's going to cost oxygen or ATP or something, and we're going to start to look at that. So as a tee-up for this concept, our heart rate and stroke volume equivalent ways to create cardiac output. And so if you do it just pure math, a heart rate of 50 and a stroke volume of 100 mils per stroke per beat gives you 5 liters, right? And quantitatively, you just do math. You say, well, I can get the same cardiac output by a heart rate of 100 and a stroke volume of 50. So mathematically they're the same. I want to know about the energetics. Do you think one of those is more expensive? That's what we're going to look at. So I want to remind you that somewhere along the line, people talk to you about what creates cardiac output. And as you know, I'm a vascularist. I think that we focus too much on the heart and neglect to notice the veins. And so I'll tell you flat out, what causes cardiac output in normal circulations is venous return. It's the blood that dumps back into the heart. That's what causes cardiac output. Now, if you, as a cardiocentrist, try to break out the elements that are making that happen, by far the biggest issue, or the biggest thing that makes hearts work well is when you dump more blood into them, when there's more stretch at the onset of the contraction, you get better contractile dynamics. Hearts that receive more blood optimize their actinomycin overlap and therefore create more force. That's the big. Two other elements. The afterload we'll see is how much pressure does the heart have to generate before it can actually push out a stroke volume. So it turns out the aortic diastolic pressure is somewhat like the afterload. It is the thing that must be overcome before you can actually squirt blood away. So this is more afterload, the worse the stroke volume. This is negative in relation to cardiac output. And then the contractile properties of the heart matter as well. This is basically, I think, the same graph. And for those of you, again, who didn't take EXP 101, and if you like, I can show you the example in office hour. But if you try to drive cardiac output simply by stimulating the heart, so you put in a catheter to the sinoatrial node and turn on the electrostimulator, just drive the heart faster, with no change in the peripheral circulation. Does anyone know how successful that is in driving cardiac output? Completely sucks. It basically doesn't work. You might get a 15% increase in cardiac output by taking your heart rate from 60 up to 210. It doesn't work because you're not augmenting venous return. So I want you in this class to think of heart rate as a follower of the circulation. I admit your heart rate does go up when you exercise, but that your brainstem is arranging for that as it observes that venous return is going up, and it can afford to increase the heart rate without lowering the stroke volume. So almost all heart rate changes that we see in natural environments are instituted as an after effect of what's happened in the general circulation. Sir?
Can you quickly remind us why the afterload is a negative factor?
Yeah. Great question. So here's the left heart. Blood squirts in, and review this on your own because this is getting old for you guys, you know it already. So when the blood of the left atrium, this contracts, blood squirts in through the mitral valve, the heart starts to pressurize, and within about 5 millimeters, the mitral valve shuts. Remember, during the beginning of systole, the aortic valve is shut also. So Sahan, here's the question. How high pressure do I have to go to before that opens up? Say again? Fairly high, and precisely, how could I measure it? How could I measure the opening pressure of the aortic valve? Another way to say it is, what's holding it shut? Jenna is pointing to the aortic arch. If you were to measure the pressure inside the aortic arch, right, if this is, say, 95, well, this won't open until in here is at 96. That's afterload. Now, imagine me off of my hypertension medicines, and my aortic arch is now risen to a diastolic pressure of 115. It's open here. It's not enough. So afterload, actually, one way to think about it, Shahan, this would be a good place to stop. One way to think about it is each cardiac contraction generates a quantum of force. And you may spend that force either as mechanical energy pumping blood forward, or you can spend it as potential energy of the blood, pressurizing the blood. And to some extent, these are inversely, you only have this much energy and you may spend it pressurizing the blood hugely, in which case you have a tiny stroke volume. Or with a low vascular resistance, you can pump a lot of blood forward because you don't have to spend as much of your energy overcoming the back. Does that make sense? It's a really good place to stop. On your own, remind yourself why there's 2 heart sounds and which valves are closing. This is part of your lab. And then we'll return to this topic on Monday by starting to remind you of the characteristics. It turns out that it's really easy when you use a flow volume loop to think about preload, afterload, and contractility. Preload is when the heart fills more. So if this curve starts to go this way, gets bigger this way, that's preload. If the heart has to generate more pressure before it opens, so if the curve moves up, that's afterload. And if the curve looks exactly the same in filling and exactly the same in vascular opening pressure, it just empties out for no apparent reason, that's contractility. So that's where we'll pick it up on. Don't worry if that blew you away. That was just one of my students heard the next lecture and came up at the end and said, "Are you just saying preload, afterload, contractility?" That's kind of embarrassing. Yeah, I'm sorry, I spent 50 minutes saying that. So that's what we'll do next time. All right? Very good. I'm going to get a workout today, but if anyone wants to walk me to my car and ask me questions and stuff, feel free to do that. Amy, I see you at 3 o'clock. I've arranged for a hot body for us to practice upon. I think it's Dr. Sliski. And it'll be fun. And you'll be impressed at how much work I got done in terms of reconfiguring the room. It's safe, it's clean, it's contaminated. It's nice. Oh, sorry, John. Where's Juan? John. Good. Big sound. Very good. Very good. Thank you.
I don't think so, because I like podcasts, like videos, I miss some stuff, and I haven't really haven't included.
Well, the low barrel receptors are providing information mostly about those. You said there are $20 it's only when is the arterial trigger ever going to go whatever. So really